Hey folks, today I've got another book I want to talk about that's about music and that also was a great influence on me as a science fiction and fantasy author. And I know those things sound like they're in complete contradiction, but bear with me, I'll show you how they merge. The book in question is called Behind the Glass by Howard Massey. The subtitle is Top Record Producers Tell How They Craft the Hits. Now, I'm a big music buff and I'm a big music industry buff. And so a book like this for me is just pure meat and potatoes. I love reading about the process of things, how stuff gets made. And so detailed interviews with people talking about how they work with artists in the studio to make music happen with all of the technical details and also all of the little sociological details. For me, it's pure catnip. I love it. My favorite interview in the whole book is the one with Nile Rodgers. And if that's a name that rings a bell, it probably should. He's the guy who was the co-founder of the band Chic. You know him from the hits Le Freak and Good Times. And he also went on to become a producer in his own right. And among the artists that he's worked with are Madonna. He helped produce Madonna's first album, for instance. And if that isn't a credential, I don't know what is. And there's a very lengthy interview in here with him where he talks about a lot of aspects of his work. And one of the things that he touches on in this is about the relationship between the producer and the artist. And I took away a lot of things from this that might not seem obvious at first. And he says, ultimately, I try and make a record for the entire world, but I know that can't be possible. When I went to see the film Pulp Fiction, I thought it was genius, yet I saw people getting up and walking out. They were offended and pissed off. And that shows you right there, you can't make everything for everybody. So when I'm making a record, I have to be very aware of who I really am making it for, my artist. If the record doesn't reflect that artist and their personality and their fan base, it doesn't make sense. It's almost a non-record. It's like when you go to a restaurant, you see a children's menu. The menu presupposes that there are a whole bunch of kids that are going to like franks and beans and fried chicken and pizza and spaghetti. You don't try and get the kids to eat caviar. And when I read that, I thought about it in terms of, if I'm a creator and I have my audience and there's my work, and that's the same kind of triad that I think reflects what he's talking about. I have to be very aware of who I really am writing my book for, which is myself first. Because if I can't make myself happy, then I can't make anybody else happy either. And my audience is going to pick up on that. If I write a book that I don't really have my heart in, that I feel is that I'm writing it just because I want to be able to say, oh, I wrote a book where X happens, or that's about Y, then it's going to filter into the work itself. And if I'm not really excited about what I'm doing, if I'm doing it just because it seems like it's something that I should be doing, or because other people are doing the same thing, then it's going to be plain on the page. It's going to be very clear that my heart's not in it. So, if anybody, I can't lie to myself. I can't lie to myself first about what kind of work I want to be doing. So, reading about that really, really touched that off for me. Another thing Niall talks about in this book that really resonated with me was when the interviewer started talking to him about the relationship between technology and creativity. And he says, for all of the technological advances of the last 20 years, do you think records today sound better than they did 20 years ago? And Niall says, no, absolutely not, because for whatever we've gained in technical superiority, it makes us not necessarily work as hard. And unless you're really into the music business, it's hard for people to see it. We could use film as a great example. With all of the technological advances they've made in the optical world, does the latest Star Wars look better than the 39 steps? I'm not so sure about that. The fact was that we had to overcome all of those problems that the equipment gave us, and the net benefit of overcoming all those variables was an artistic statement in and of itself. In the old days, we all used to play together in the same room, and I realized after going back and listening to some of these records that there was a blend and a vibe going on in that room that to me translated into that record. The old restrictions in technology forced us to do things right. It forced us to have to make decisions. It forced us to be spiritually so in tune with the other people that magic had to happen. It made you step up to the plate. Whereas now, when I go to play on someone's record, I feel uncomfortably free, and I almost hate that. I can actually play on a record all day long and do 10 different solos and take all these different approaches to the rhythm and all kinds of stuff. And then the producer has to look at all this work like a film. They have to go back and edit and figure out which bits they want to use. Whereas in the old days, when a person hired me to work on a record, I had to get it right there. You had to play great. You had to be smoking, and there was no way they could fix it and make it better. When I played on Michael Jackson's last record, I knew what they were going to do. And so I just said, hey, Michael, here's like a billion ideas. I'm going to play all this cool stuff, and you guys go off and do it. So I didn't have to write it, so to speak. I didn't have to give them the definitive perfect guitar part. I gave them lots of definitive perfect guitar parts, and they decided which ones to use. That's weird to me. Once you're unlimited, you'll never play that same way. You'll just go on and on and on and on. It's like the ultimate jazz person's fantasy. You mean to tell me I'm going to solo for the rest of my life and you guys will think it's great? And the interviewer says, having infinite options also means you don't have the pressure on you. And Nile says, it's pressureless. And I thought that was such a fantastic way to put it. It's pressureless. This got me really thinking about how a lot of the technology that we now have so casually available to us makes this work so easy to do, and yet at the same time, so hard to make the tough decisions about. A couple of books ago, I ended up with a book that was somewhere in the 300,000 word range. That was 2.5 years of my life, and believe me, I enjoyed the 2.5 years I spent writing it. I also have no intention of ever repeating that again, because that really taught me firsthand just how easy it is to give yourself permission to do things forever and to say, oh, well, I won't edit it because in theory, I don't have to. It's my work. It's going to be as long as I want it to be. If I put it out digitally, it's not necessarily going to take up a significantly greater percentage of room in someone's storage device than, if it's only 100,000 words instead of 300,000. I mean, yeah, the actual book itself is this massive dumpling sitting on the shelf, but, that's for the people that want that sort of thing. And when I was done and I look back on it, I was for the most part proud of what I did, but I was also very conscious of how I had not restrained myself, of how I had lost sight of the way that the limitations that exist in any medium, with any set of systems, whether it's a typewriter or whether it's a word processor, I had ignored the lessons that they were trying to teach me. There was a time when I was working on a book. This was like right at the beginning of my self-publishing career, and I had gotten to the bottom of a page, and my whole computer froze, and I couldn't remember the last time I had autosaved anything, and I panicked. I mean, the whole system was locked up so hard I couldn't even use the 3-key reboot. So I said, well, here's what I'm going to do, and I dug out my digital camera and I took a picture of the screen. And I hard reset the system, and I found, to my immense relief, that I only had to retype a couple of paragraphs from when I had lost control of the system. But the whole time that I was going through this, I was saying to myself, would it really be the worst thing in the world if I had to retype all of that stuff and just start with a clean slate? Would it really have been the worst thing? I mean, it was nice to get it back, but it was also nice to be able to dig down into myself and say, I could have rewritten this if I needed to. I'm glad I didn't have to, but I know that within me, I have the capacity to say, yeah, let's do this again. Let's do this from scratch. So reading those words made me think about how it's too easy to take this stuff for granted, especially when it gives you so much freedom. It gives you the freedom to never have to make decisions. And that's not a good thing. You always want to cultivate, wherever possible, a sense of how this technology is allowing you to escape the need to make decisions, hard decisions, where to start, where to begin, what to keep and what to leave out. Because really that's what this whole thing is about, man. It's about making those kinds of decisions. Those are not auxiliaries, those are not pain points. That's the whole ball game right there. It's figuring out where things begin and end. There's another passage towards the end of the interview where he talks about the wonderful experiences that he had working with David Bowie, because he was producer on David Bowie's Let's Dance album. And he said, the more you know, the greater the palette of colors you have to choose from. He's talking about getting different musical experiences under your belt. You have to study the information and equipment and songs that have come before us, because each one of those is a project in and of itself. When Bowie and I did Let's Dance, we got a pile of records and we sat down and studied them. They were from all different areas of music. We listened to the Pink Panther and we listened to Cab Calloway. We listened to the Beach Boys and we listened to the Beatles. We just took licks from all over the place and stuck them in. It wasn't samples. It was ideas. It was licks. It was stuff. We were superimposing all different parts of pop music and culture. David would say obscure things like, let's not listen to anything that's been played in the last 20 years. Let's act as if the blues had never been invented. And I had never done that before. People had told me stories about them doing that with my records, but I never did that with anyone else's records. Up until Let's Dance, every musical idea came from my memory. I never studied other people's stuff before I made my records. And now that I'm getting ready to make my next crop of records, I think I might try that whole Let's Dance philosophy again. Listen to a bunch of different things and see if that inspires me to write riffs and play differently. Sometimes it's good to look back in order to get the inspiration to go forward. I mean, the main thing is that he's talking about, first off, he's talking about studying things that are outside of your immediate sphere. You know, that if you've been immersed in popular music of the last, 10 to 15 years your whole life, then you get outside of those last 10 to 15 years and you go back 30 years, you go back 50 years, you go back 70 years, and you listen for stuff that makes you go, yeah, there's something there, there's something I want to use. But instead of copying it, you look at it and you ask yourself, what's the context? What was the rest of the music life when this was going on? Was this a contrast to it, or was this just falling in line with everything else? Was this something revolutionary, or was this something very mundane? Does it sound revolutionary to me now? So you don't just listen to, steal a riff. You listen as a way to get a lesson. And it's the same way with reading. When I was doing a lot more reading of nonfiction, and I was trying to ingest that into my work and saying to myself, I don't just want to read other science fiction and take inspiration from that. I want to get as far outside of that as I possibly can. And so reading what Nile was talking about there triggered off the same kind of feeling in my head, that it was a good thing for me to get away from that stuff and to look out as far as possible in different directions, because that's healthy. That's how really interesting things happen. And the other thing he talks about is something that science fiction is really good at, which is what's called a subjunctive mode, where you say things like, what if this never happened? What if that never happened? And he was talking about, what if we had popular music what would popular music sound like if the Beatles had never come into existence? There's actually a whole book. I'm forgetting the name of it. I have to go dig it up and talk about it. That talks about this very idea that popular music before and after the Beatles was drastically different, not necessarily in a good way. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of thing that you'd find in a science fiction story, where you'd say, what if this had never happened? And, that kind of what if is the kind of thing that you should try to think about for more than just, say, a technological innovation or a turn in history. It could be anything. It could. On this note, there was a science fiction author by the name of Howard Waldrop, and he wrote a short story that was published in Omni many years ago called Ike at the Mic. And the idea was wonderful. He basically took the cultural scene of the late 1950s, like the post-World War II era in the U.S., and he took a handful of people from popular music and a handful of people from politics, and he swapped their roles. So you had people like Elvis being a senator, and you had people like George Patton being a drummer who gets kicked out of the band because he's too wild. That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of, where you're not just trying to do the obvious what if, but you're trying to dig a layer further down. And reading about stuff like this actually happening, about people actually doing that kind of what if work in real life with a real creation, that really spurred me to think about how I could do the same thing with my own. So once again, the book is called Behind the Glass by Howard Massey. It is still in print. There is actually a sequel, which I also have, which has a great many other producers also interviewed. I did not find it quite as good as the first book. Really, the first book is just astounding for how many people they talk to and how much good information there is in it. But the second one is still worth picking up if you find the first one interesting. And in the future, I'm probably going to do a lot more videos about books about music, because I just find myself getting so much inspiration for the work that I do from the work that these people do. So until next time, see you around.